Welcome or see you in Valhalla podcast. Today it is just me again, but we will be discussing the 10 component of fitness. Today we're talking about strength, but I wanted to start with a potentially, um, I guess it could be seen as a controversial topic, but I think if you really think it through and do the exercise, you realize it's not controversial. It's pretty black and white, but um, that was just something that I heard Greg Glassman say, which is um, political correctness is on the bridge between truth and absurdity. And I just thought that was interesting because when I do exercises around what is politically correct and whatnot, I start thinking it does seem like it's stemming from some sort of social marketing type uh, deviation from the truth, um, in large. So it's an interesting way to think about it. So like words that you would say are politically correct or whatever, uses of words or whatever, or words that you're deeming not politically correct. If you're looking at what their actual definition is and using it in that term, does it make it not politically correct? And that's just something interesting that I've been thinking about. And I'd like you guys to partake in the exercise a little bit. I'm not going to go any deeper into that, but today we're going to try to keep this relatively brief. We're talking about strength. It's a very exciting topic for most people because it is just a very common word, right? So here at CrossFit Magni, we look at who is Magni. Well, he is the god of strength in Norse mythology. So strength oftentimes means more than the definition we'll be assigning it today. But I think we have to be clear on what definition we're talking about when we're talking about the 10 components of fitness. But oftentimes the word gets thrown around as far as like emotional strength or, um, you know, that's probably the most common. I'm trying to think of some other scenarios where we say the word strength, but we don't actually mean this definition of it. It's just not uncommon to use it that way. Like uh, so and so is a strong runner doesn't necessarily mean what we're talking about when we're actually talking about the definition of strength today. All right. So when we look at the definition that I'm showing on the screen, you see the ability of a muscular unit or combination of muscular units to apply force. All right. So that is the nerdy kind of like scientific definition, right? But what I want to emphasize is that CrossFit does have another approach to this definition, and that is the applied application of force or application of force. So not only what's that contractile potential, like that original definition, but taking it a step further and can you apply it to moving an object, right? Because contractile potential is useless if it cannot be imparted in the real world. All right, so think about the contractile potential of your quadriceps. Well, if that can't stand you up out of the bottom of a squat, it's irrelevant how hard that muscle can contract. It also needs to be applied in functional patterns. And the way that that presents itself is that if you aren't set up in a biomechanical position to leverage that, then you won't see it in real life. And so I like that taking it into a real world application side of things because I think it's really what separates the way we talk about strength versus something else. That the object has to move. Now, when we're talking about strength training, most commonly strength is going to be trained like into 1 to 6 rep range, right? So you won't see strength really being applied at higher numbers, although there is carryover there, right? So if I do a 20 rep max back squat, there's going to be some carryover to my 1 rep max, because there is going to be recruiting more and more muscular units in that 20 rep that now I have access to in my 1 rep. So my strength could actually go up from doing higher reps as well, but it's most commonly trained strength purely in the 1 to 5 rep range. And the reason that we want to separate that rep range out and think about it that way is simply because if we are looking at um, strength on, like, let's say 20 reps, there's a lot of other things that start coming into play, like fatigue starts setting in, and um, we're looking at swelling starts becoming a factor, and it starts changing our ability to produce force because of other reasons. And we're really looking for what's purely strength, which needs to be under all of those kind of symptoms, which is why strength training is a lot of fun, because it doesn't hurt as bad in most cases, right? And if it does hurt, it's because we're usually lacking in our accessory work somewhere, to the point where things are being overloaded that aren't prepared for that load. For instance, your back. Um, all this to say, uh, we want to be able to move something. Now, we don't need to move it fast. And that's important, because as we get down the line into other components of fitness, you're kind of looking at what's the mass that we can move, right? So force equals mass times acceleration. We're kind of thinking we don't care so much about the acceleration piece as much as we care about the mass, right? What's the weight? Can we move it in the direction, I would argue, in the direction that we're looking to move it to, right? That makes it more functional too, because if you're moving it, but you're moving it in a different direction, you might actually be changing movement altogether. Most of the situations you see in the gym are just going to be pretty straightforward. I think the way that you try to approach this in CrossFit is that you have to give yourself time, because strength is actually highly neurological, right? So recruiting as many muscular units as possible is basically your brain's job to tell you to do that. The weight and feeling that desperation to do that, that's what starts making that link to the brain. So you have to have a very high demand on it. And when you have a high demand on it, the problem with that we see in a lot of the way people try to approach strength training is they do it under fatigue, or they're um, resting minimally, like resting 2 minutes. When you rest 2 minutes, the chances are that all of those tissues that you're looking to use, all those muscular units that you need to use, the chances that those have recovered fully and are ready for another truly max effort or truly heavy effort is smaller and smaller every time you're resting 2 minutes. So we typically want to see a rest period of, over 3 minutes on this to be done properly. And that means that the weight needs to be so significant that one, you should kind of feel that you need it, because you won't be able to lift that weight again without it, right? Um, but that's something that in application that we see go wrong a lot, is just people don't rest long enough to truly see and produce strength. Now, if we're just testing, there's situations where we might intentionally be under fatigue to test it, and that's fine too. But all in all, what we're looking at is, can we produce the force that we're looking to produce with strength training? Um, I would argue that you really shouldn't need to train this more than twice a week, unless you're being a specific athlete, in which case you should be training it probably a little bit more frequently. But it all kind of comes down to, what can the nervous system really recover from? And when we're really doing heavy 1 to 5s, the chances are we're not able to repeat over and over and over again. So we can't train this too frequently. We're truly going to the dark place with strength training, which, if you want the best adaptation, you really want to emphasize that. Now, you could talk percentage work, where you're doing less percentages so that you can do them more frequently. That's a strategy as well. But again, that turns into more specifics, I think, where you're specifically trying to squat for sake of a squat. Whereas in CrossFit, the goal is to be generally good at all these things. So you squat 1 week, press later in the same week, let's say, and then the next week you deadlift. And maybe do a lunge pattern later in the week or something like that, or pull, right? So, or a pull up, right? If we're thinking pull. So there's just other options, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds of how to program your strength training so much as just understanding the values that it has, right? So When we're looking at the effects of longevity on our bodies, we need to understand a few things. That one, yes, muscle mass is making a strong correlation to our ability to live a long, prosperous life when it comes to our physical activity, as well as our mental ability, right? So don't forget that strength training is also going to work that mental acuity side of things because it is working your brain. It is giving it a challenge. So it's not separate. It's not like learning a language and strength training are completely different to the brain as far as what process is happening within it. So, with that in mind, we go, uh, how does strength training then? Because strength training doesn't necessarily mean you're going to gain muscle mass. If you're doing heavy sets of 1 to 5, you probably won't gain a significant amount of muscle mass because there's not as much swelling that we were talking about. There's not as much tearing down of the muscle because you're not doing as many reps, right? So we're not looking at building muscle when we're doing strength training. We're looking at coordinating that muscle, getting that muscle to fire better, recruiting more units for a singular goal, right? So it's not usually going to make people bigger. So women that are afraid to strength train, thinking they're going to get too big, it's kind of a misnomer because it's the bodybuilding type stuff that will do that. It's which is longer sets typically. What we're looking at is heavy, heavy singles, doubles, triples, and things like that. Now, the big lifts are usually what's the sexiest with strength training. And that's because when you're looking at, longevity, it's like this is the most bang for my buck. If I get really good at this squat and then I test it and I'm going really heavy in the squat, I'm getting the quads, the glutes, the hamstrings, the calves, like all these things are kind of starting to fire together. The core is working really hard, the upper back, depending on what kind of squat it is, right? Like all of these things are coming together to produce this force. So we're getting a ton of muscular unit contraction. So we're burning a ton of calories as well, but we're also like, we're learning the whole body is being taxed in a shorter amount of time. Whereas if we had to parcel off each of these muscle groups, it would take, a full hour to get the same training effect as a few minutes of a squat. That being said, if we're technically not proficient, how are we going to properly strength train it? And that's where I argue you probably won't. A novice in their 1 rep max is close to the same number as their 5 rep max because they're not there yet. They don't have that technical proficiency yet. So if you're in that kind of novice category, a higher amount of reps is actually going to improve your strength faster than doing singles would because you don't have this technical proficiency to a point where you can challenge the load so much. So you just work on a few more reps, but you still want it to be very physically demanding for what you can access. Now, if range of motion is something you're not accessing, you kind of have to accept that the strength you're gaining is at the end point of range of motion. So like squat's probably the easiest thing to talk about on this. If we're really strong above parallel, but the second we go below parallel, we can't do half the weight. We have to learn that that's probably okay because we're recruiting in other areas going below parallel that we're not used to recruiting. And we're so far ahead above parallel that we don't really need to spend a lot of focus there, right? And the vice versa could be true, but I've never really seen that where maybe you're strong below parallel, but you're not very strong above parallel. Never really seen that because it just doesn't make as much sense due to the way we are kind of trained from a younger age. Like running is all that top end range of the motion. Um, so when we look at the longevity piece, we're teaching our muscles to do things. So it doesn't matter how much muscle mass you have if that muscle doesn't know how to apply it to real life. All right. And that's where things like squats are better for the long run. But again, if we can't truly strength train the squat, then we have to find something else like the leg press or something like that. It's a little easier access. Right. I think it's worth the while in the pursuit of to get the squat because what's not being learned on the leg press is how to decelerate your knee flexion when you're moving against gravity. So think of if you jumped down from a height and you were landing, your knee is going to bend, and it's going to do it in a plane and in a surface and with balance and all that stuff that you're mimicking a little bit more so with a squat, a lot more so with a squat versus a leg press where you're laying on your back and pushing weight. There is no balance needed. There's no coordination. There's no that, it's really just kind of focused on, can you extend your knee against this load, right? So it doesn't really carry over to that falling scenario where it's, can we resist the knee extension and decelerate ourselves while staying balanced and not falling over? So that's why things like the squat are going to be put on a pedestal above a leg press or a leg extension, especially, right? Um, but you could use the leg extension and the leg press or whatever if you need to, due to like injuries or due to the inability to do squat for whatever reason, right? And still strength train. And like I said, 1 to 5 is the magic zone, but you still can get some crossover into the 20 rep range, and even further, because sometimes especially when you're new, just doing a movement, even if it was 100 times consecutively, your body's learning how to be more efficient at that. Your brain's like, okay, fire this, done, and it makes that path even better and more efficient every time. So the connection, the energy, all of that stuff will recover faster. It'll start optimizing the tissue over time and things like that. This is another one of those um, organic adaptations. So what that means again is that there is something physically changing inside of you, right? So for strength training, you're typically going to see a fast twitch muscle fiber um, rate between fast twitch and slow twitch in a set of muscles. Let's say you're going to see more fast twitch coming up, right? And that's really kind of a good thing, because as we age, those tend to be the first ones to suffocate and fall apart, is those fast twitch. So we're really trying to fight that by staying strong, by keeping our ability to apply force to the world and external loads and the against gravity, whatever. We're trying to maintain that as we age. So strength training is all about, can I apply this force readily and such. Now, when you combine it with other components of fitness, you will start seeing how it builds that whole picture. So if we have an enormous amount of stamina and strength, where we're brought both those up, you're going to be able to, let's say it was hike in to pack somebody out. You'll have kind of like this crossover where it's like, I need the stamina in my legs, but I also need the strength to lift another human on top of that, right? So that's where you see the crossover, is like, not only do I have stamina, I have stamina and an incredible amount of strength with it. And you're teaching, you can cross that and blur the lines. We talked about it on the stamina, where you talk about strength endurance sets, where it's like, now you're doing heavy sets of 8 and 6 and 10 or whatever, and that's working on that combination between strength and stamina. When you're looking at, where does cardiovascular endurance and strength have crossover, you're really looking at the cardiovascular endurance is going to improve your ability to train more strength. So it's going to allow, because if you have a higher cardiovascular adaptation, it is going to clear waste out, muscle recovery is going to improve, oxygen use is going to be improved over the course of the day and things like that. And what that really means is that your recovery in between sets and in between workouts is going to be higher. So it could allow for more frequent strength training at higher levels, at higher intensities. So that's where we see the crossover to these other two above, right? Flexibility, you were going to see a tremendous crossover in strength and flexibility, where it can go both ways. If you really train strength in a certain range, your body will optimize that range. But it could come at the cost of a full flexibility at a deeper range, let's say, because it's optimizing it. So a power lifter typically has trouble squatting below 90 degrees, because really most of their competitions are done right at 90. Now that's not like a true 90. It's technically like 90 relative to the floor, and the doesn't take into account shin angle or anything. Point being, they're optimized for that. so their body creates tightness everywhere else so that it can just be so much stronger right there. Now, if we train, an Olympic lifter who can be pretty close, I mean, they can get pretty close to those same numbers, but they can go all the way down, all the way up. They have a decent amount of flexibility. So there is crossover there. Um, but it's just all about, kind of what you do, your body adapts to. And you could take flexibility training tools and apply force to them. Like you can see, how can I apply force to this flexibility protocol? Can I squeeze a muscle at its end range already, where it's like it's already feeling shortened? How do I make it feel shorter or strong in that position? So think of sitting on your butt with your legs straight out in front of you. For a lot of guys, especially, this is about their maximum range of motion with their legs straight like that. So to ask them to then lift their leg up while still sitting straight and tall can be very difficult for a guy to do that, because they have to learn how to recruit new muscle just to do that. So it literally is strength training, but because we don't see this huge load to it, where we've extended the lever, and that is the load, right? We've also put ourselves in a position where a lot of the fibers cannot be innervated as easily as if we were standing straight up and down and having to lift up. Right. So think of hanging and then lifting your legs. You might have an easier time getting your legs higher because you're going from a lengthened position. You're able to recruit more muscle to do that. But when you're already in that um, shortened position where you're sitting on the ground and you have to just lift that much further, it's going to be more challenging. And it's just kind of a cool way to think about it. Like strength training is all types of contractions. So um, they just need to be hard. They should need to be difficult to do. And sometimes strength training sometimes creates zero movement. You look at isometric strength. What's your ability to just hold a position despite other forces acting on it? Usually that's gravity, right? Gravity, you could even add, like if you added weights to your plank, you have gravity plus all the help from weight being in gravity side, basically. Um, so you can apply some of that there. Now, remembering that that is going to recruit more muscle units, so it is kind of like that technical definition of strength. But remember, in the real world, we also need the applied, like, can it produce some sort of force or resist a force? I guess we should be looking at it from both lenses: produce and resist force. And that's really the key to longevity right there, right? As far as like, where does this fit in? Well, I want to be able to produce and resist force as long as I live so that I can do the activities I want to do. No matter how simple the activity is, there is a degree of producing and resisting force, always a battle between those two going on. And sometimes you have to overcome things, and sometimes you have to just stabilize and be resilient. So strength training is a lot of fun. It's not going to make you big. And I think the word strength training gets thrown around too much um, as well. So if I wanted to be picky about, if you go to like a boot camp class and they're saying you'll be stronger, it's for a novice, yes, you 100% would be stronger, because doing anything from doing nothing makes you stronger, right? If we're just talking relative. But if you truly are wanting to strength train, you have to start incorporating heavy loads with really long rest periods. Because once you get more experienced, that boot camp crap is going to plateau. It is not going to continue taking you very far in strength. So keep that in mind. It is not optimized for strength. What they're doing is saying everybody's going to gain strength if you go from doing nothing to doing something. And so they're kind of piggybacking off that and marketing to target those people who think they want to be strong, and they think just seeing people moving their bodies is strong. It is relative to sitting on a couch. But if we're talking strong relative to what we can do as humans and what our own potential is, it's hardly going to scratch the surface. That's kind of one of my biggest complaints in the fitness industry, is all the branding and marketing around strength training with no actual strength training involved. Um, I would like to argue that that's stamina and endurance, and you're just getting the first wave adaptation to strength because you're moving versus not moving. Real strength training is usually going to be second and third wave adaptations. Third wave is typically what we're avoiding in CrossFit. It's highly specific, but second wave is kind of general, but it's above that first wave. So let me look it up. I'll show you guys the definition. Waves of adaptation. Strength. Let's see. That's training adaptations for endurance training. What's the oh, if I could find it for you guys. I should have found this before I did this. I should have known this was where this was going. I will say that was cool because it brought up a couple CrossFit things first thing, which is kind of cool. See that doing well. Oh man, there's really a lot of garbage out there. Um, yeah, guys, I can't find the actual note on this, so I won't bore you any longer with it. But point being, there are typically considered three waves of adaptation to both strength and endurance. They are a little bit different, but um, in the strength world, the first wave of adaptation is literally kind of like it's just like motor unit skill, you could think, where it's like if I do a movement over and over and over again, my body gets more efficient at it. Um, whereas wave two is going to be like an actual structural potential change there. And then wave three is even more specific depending on what sport you play. So if I was really a strength training athlete, I would have to be pushing myself extremely hard in those heavy reps. And I would kind of have to minimize the amount of high volume work that I'm doing that is that particular strength test. So if it was the deadlift, let's say, I wouldn't want to do really sets of 30 on the deadlift. I would want to get really good at my probably just at the most 8 reps there, and then use accessory work for higher level or higher number of repetitions. So like think reverse hypers, things like that, where we recruit muscles a little differently than the deadlift. Those are where I would take kind of like those high rep stuff and get my capacity. But if I'm really trying to get that third wave adaptation, it's just got to be pounded really hard, and that's like 5 minute rest every single rep. And if you watch those guys train, it takes them an hour to do like 3 sets, 3 heavy singles, let's say, because there's so much prep, there's so much warm up, there's so much rest as they're building, right? Because if they're doing 3 working singles, then you can already look at like 15 minutes almost, well, 10 minutes of rest just there, plus the 5 minutes before the first. So that's 15 minutes of just resting alone just for 3 working sets, let alone they're not just building up to that percentage really quickly and no rest. They're resting all in those intervals all along the way. So the stronger you are, the more you're trying to adapt to a deeper level of strength, the longer your rest periods, the longer it takes to train. So keep that stuff in mind. Strength training is a lot of fun. Definitely needs to be a primary focus in anybody's program. I mean, I don't know very many of an older population, especially that have a tremendous amount of strength because it's oftentimes considered dangerous. And dangerous things are only things that you haven't ever done. But start building strength, get a coach, they'll help you along the way. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them in comments, subscribe, all that fun stuff. We'll be hopefully back on our routine next week with the co-hosts and having more co-hosts. But this week we're still just kicking it solo, and hopefully I didn't bore you guys to tears. But I think that you should definitely strength train.